Language is something that's pretty close to my heart. I'm a person that's worked with language most of my life and certainly all of my professional career. I came up through advertising as a writer. It's something that I pay a lot of attention to, and obviously it's important to all of us. So when I was given this theme, I thought, yeah, I can probably figure out something to say about it and to talk about. And so what we're going to cover this morning is language, what its origin, its impact on human society, what it means to all of us. And then I think the aspect that we all don't think about enough, and the thing that I want to leave you with today, is the impact that language has on us as individuals. Does that sound okay to talk about? All right. So I sort of began with this idea of asking kind of the most basic question that you can ask, which is, what is language? What is it? How do we define it? How do we talk about it? And one of the very first definitions that you'll come across is from our old friend Aristotle, who said that language is a sound with meaning. And that is a definition that intrinsically makes sense. It seems to be true. Rings good within the ear. But as I began to kind of probe a little bit further, I realized, man, there is a deep pool of debate and thought about this question, and that it is not really as simple as Aristotle might have put it. And this pool is got water dumping into it from great thinkers like Noam Chomsky, who's an intellectual and a philosopher and known as the father of modern linguistics, an amazing thinker. There's a ton of people. Steven Pinker, who's a professor of psychology at Harvard University and who has spent 35 years just thinking about this very question of what is language, what does it mean, and where does it come from, and how does it impact us. So one of the interesting things that I sort of figured out as I just dipped my toe in this pool. So by the way, please don't ask me questions later on language, because I don't know that I have any answers for you. So I just began to sort of dip my toe into this pool. And one of the things that I discovered really was that language is actually really relatively new to us as a human species. Ian Tattersall, who's that guy up there, he's an anthropologist. And he says that as early as 30,000 years ago, and maybe as late as 100,000 years ago, somewhere within that window, that's when the advent of language became a part of humanity. And part of the evidence that he shows to this, I believe this is a picture of the oldest known cave painting. And that is the oldest known, and it's only, and I say only, 39,000 years old. And of course, something like that, which demonstrates abstract thinking, demonstrates thinking that's outside of ourselves, demonstrates expression, all of that is of course analogous to having language. Only 39,000 years ago, and that's the oldest one we've found. So language is a relatively new thing. And that brings up debate among, again, in this deep pool of scholars. Did the Neanderthal, did they have language as we know it? And Tattersall argues that no, that they didn't. That even though they may have had the physical capability, they had the ears, they may have had the larynx, they could do this, that language is inherently and uniquely a product of Homo sapien. And that's interesting since we live side by side, right? If we put that into creatures that we're a little bit more familiar with, if we consider our friends here, the chimpanzee, these are animals that we believe, we know that they're intelligent, that we believe have a rich inner life, can process emotions, have thoughts and feelings. And certainly their auditory system, the way that they can bring in information into their brains, is as well developed as ours and as capable of ours, and yet they cannot begin to do what a human child instinctively, reflexively does, which as Chomsky puts it, The human child can look out into this buzzing, confusing, popping, loud, noisy world and begin to grab in these things that make up language, begin to assimilate that, begin to compute that, and begin to utilize it in a creative way. And that's a key that we'll talk on later. And Darwin noted that human children, almost from the very beginning, are babbling, trying to use language, trying to communicate, trying to get things out. And yet, they don't necessarily automatically pick up pens and brushes, don't automatically start trying to bake or brew or any of the things that we associate with our society. They do instinctively, reflectively try to speak. And so Chomsky says language is an instrument of thought, and that is the real key, that it is an instrument of thought. It is not thought itself, but it is an instrument of thought. And so if you take a look at that from that angle, we can reevaluate what Aristotle said, that language is a sound with meaning, and sort of reassemble that and understand that language is meaning with sound. And the best definition, as I've been able to sort of put it together for myself, as I guess considered this question for the first time in my life, is that when we ask what is language, that language is a way to package thought. It is how we take all this big computational power that we have within ourselves and we package it and share it. Language is that. It is how we package our thoughts. And it is what makes us quintessentially, fundamentally human. It is the thing that separates us from all other creatures that we've ever met. It is the thing that makes us human, and the thing that sets us apart. And there's a great amount of computational power. There's a great amount of complexity. There's a great amount of difficulty that is associated with language. And frankly, it is not a talent to be taken lightly. It is so easy for us, it is so instinctive for us, that we just think, well, it's just, everybody learns to talk. That's really not so hard. But it is not a talent that we should take lightly. There's a book called Crazy English, which points out that all of us can understand that we park in the driveway but drive on the parkway, that a house is burning up while it's burning down, and that we fill out a form by filling it in, right? That all makes sense to us, but the computational power needed to sort through all those rules and all of that stuff is really pretty amazing, and something that we really shouldn't take for granted. Pinker shared this particular example, which I thought was interesting, that we are so much masters of language that we don't even have to use the right words to communicate what we mean. So here we've got this guy saying, "Would you like to come up and see my etchings?" Right? Now we know that he's not asking her if she would like to come up and see his etchings. She knows that that's not what he means. He knows that she knows that that's not what he means. And she knows that he knows that she knows that that's not what he means, right? And that is why, if you think about that aspect alone, that part of our humanity, that ability to discern language and meaning, even when it's completely veiled, that's why creating artificial intelligence is so damn hard, right? That, we are not Siri. We are not the product of a bunch of pre-programmed inputs that we got. And in fact, that's the key. And that's why language is an appropriate creative talking point, because language is the heart of creativity. It is the essence of creativity. It is where it all begins. And it is not pre-programmed. It is not, we don't just hear things and then repeat them. We create things and take it out. So a thing to think about here is we start with a finite. In fact, language is one of those things that physicists would tell you is sort of, well, it shouldn't be possible. Because we start with finite, we have 25 characters. We've only got so many brain cells. We've only got so much vocabulary, right? So that's all finite resources, and yet language is infinite. Every thought that has ever been thought is expressed through language. Every thought that ever will be thought, ever can be thought, can be expressed through language. This is the infinite from the finite. And that is the quintessential mystery of language and the source of that deep pool of debate. How is this possible? What does it mean? And where do we go? So Pinker said, you will speak sentences today that you've never spoken before. And in fact, you may speak a sentence today that has never been spoken before. Language inherently creates. Language inherently creates. We make things with language. And that can be things like great plays, great books, great movies. But language can also, in my opinion, create reality for us. Language gave us the incentive to go to the moon, the mission to go to the moon, right? Language was a big part, has been and will be a big part of sending us to war. Language has a lot of impact on us. So if language can change the world, if it can create the world, can make things in the world, I think we underestimate its ability to create us and to make us and to shape us. And that's really the thing that I want to spend the rest of my time talking about with you, is how language really impacts us. So I'm going to ask you to consider some words, some language that has shaped you. Some words that you hold on to, some words that you believe. And these don't have to be negative words. These can be positive words. But words that you believe are true about yourself that you hold on to and how that has shaped you. So you can go back to the playground, you can go back to the classroom, you can go back to the bedroom last week, wherever those words were spoken. Words that you're holding on to, language that you're holding on to, that mean something to you, that shape something to you, that tell you something about yourself. And while you ponder that, I want to introduce you to Don Miguel Ruiz, who's an author that wrote a great book called The Four Agreements. And The Four Agreements is inherently about language. It's inherently about words and how they impact us as people and the things that they create for us in people. And Ruiz says, if you really consider, if you think about those words that I asked you to think about, those words that have shaped you, those words that have held on to you, oh, you're smart, you're a smart cookie, oh, you're so creative, oh, you're so funny, right? Those things that you believe are true about yourself. The question to ask yourself is, with all of language's creative power, in all of its inherent ability to make things, how many of those words are original to you? And how many of those words, how much of that language has been placed there by other people, sometimes well-meaning? So he says, let's consider our parents. They had an awful lot to tell us as we grew up about who we are, the kinds of expectations that we should have, the kind of things that we ought to believe, the kind of things that were important to be part of society. Our teachers have told us an awful lot about our capabilities, about what's important, about what we ought to strive for. And then there are those of us in advertising and media and design and entertainment, and we spend an awful lot of time telling you about things that you probably ought to want, things that we think you ought to need, and what kind of person you will be if you have those things. So as you think about the language that makes you, if you think about the language that defines you, how much of that is original thought? How much of that came from you? And how much of it was placed from the outside? And Ruiz calls that our domestication. He's great, but he calls that our domestication. That language is one way that we domesticate ourselves, and that how we domesticate others in terms of, this is how you're supposed to be. These are the things you're supposed to think. This is who you are. That person over there, that's who they are. That's what they do. This is what you do. You stay there. They'll go over there. And again, this isn't done necessarily for nefarious reasons. It's just kind of the human condition. It's kind of what we do. Remember, language creates. It can create reality. So with that, he says that language can only be true if we agree to it. He calls it the agreement. So someone says, hey, JJ, you are a short guy, right? Well, we'd all agree with that, right? But I agree with that. But again, the veiled part, that's the part I don't have to agree with. That means that I can't achieve certain amounts of success. There are certain things that I can't do. There are certain things that won't happen for me because of that. That's the part I don't have to agree with. That's the part that you can reject. So as you consider this language in your life, it's important to understand, what am I going to agree with? What am I going to agree to? And what have I agreed to? And he gives us 4 new agreements that he says are intended to overwrite and supersede all previous agreements we've made. And he gives us these to practice, and he says if you'll make these 4 new agreements, you can supersede and overwrite all of that other language, all of that stuff that you once believed is true. And get that out of your head and start looking at it a new way. So I'm going to share this with you now. This first agreement, and he speaks of language as the word, right? So the first agreement is, he says, be impeccable with your word. And I think that's too easy to dismiss as, well, keep your promises, don't say things you don't mean. I think the deeper part of this thing, be impeccable with your word, means not only be impeccable with the word that you may use with other people, but in particular, and most important, be impeccable in the words that you use with yourself. Think about how often you beat the living hell out of yourself over stuff. Think about how often you self-criticize. And think how you tap back into those other agreements, that language that you believe to be true, to support that activity. Be impeccable with your word about yourself. Be a little forgiving of yourself. Be more than a little forgiving of yourself. And catch yourself when those words are coming, when those thoughts are there, when that language is being used. Catch it. Say, that's not impeccable. I'm not going to say that to myself. I'm not going to believe that about myself. I'm going to let that go. And also remember that if language inherently creates, if language is inherently out there making things, it is important then to realize the impact that your words have on other people. And sure, don't be so careless with that. Understand what that can mean, particularly with people over whom you hold influence. So that's be impeccable with your word. The second one, don't take anything personally. I think this one is probably the hardest agreement to make, but it's a really important one. Don't take anything personally. What he says is that really anything, any language that is handed to you from another person has everything to do with them and nothing to do with you. No matter how awesome or awful it is, it really has everything to do with them and nothing to do with you. And I think this is a really hard one. I tried to think of a good way to illustrate this. So I want you to think about, we've all got the negative Nelly in our life, the person who always, everything is always terrible, right? Saturday Night Live did the skit Debbie Downer. We all know Debbie Downer, right? We all know her or him. And that person is someone that what do we end up doing? We end up not taking them personally anymore, right? We're like, man, that is your world that you're living in, and I just do not see it that way, right? I think that's the key of this. that is all about you. And that doesn't have much to do with me. And another way to look at it is just in your own mind, think about the times when you were really envious, or when you were jealous of something, and ask yourself, did that really have much to do with the other person, people, or situation involved? Or did it really have to do with your own insecurity? It really had more to do with you than it does the other people. So don't take things personally. This is a hard one, I think. Closely related and most important, and the one I think can change all of us the most, is the third agreement, which is don't make assumptions. We have this powerful faculty for language. We have this powerful ability to share thoughts and words and meaning, and yet we skip over it all the time and just assume that we know what everybody else is thinking. Right? I know X, I assume Y, so therefore Z is true. Right? We do it all the time. We totally make assumptions on what other people are thinking, what they're feeling, why they're acting a certain way. And this is the one that if we stop doing it, a lot of things get a lot better really fast, particularly for the tortured creative mind, right? We're really interested in making a lot of assumptions about things. And I'll give you a real life example. I am the kind of person that is in meetings all day long. And during those meetings, I get a lot of emails. And sometimes after those meetings, I just want to drink vodka. So I don't always get to the emails promptly. It happens. So I had a person who'd made a request via email that I didn't respond to, and who came up to me the next day. And that person not only assumed that I was saying no to that request, but they also assumed that I talked about it with everybody else that I was in the meeting with, and that they all had an opinion, and that's the reason why, that we said no, and don't we know this, and don't we know that, and I'm like, hey, you made all of that up, man. That is complete fiction. And I actually went to my computer and I'm like, look, and it was still, bold. I'm like, I haven't even looked at it. I haven't had a chance. So no, how often do we do that in our lives? How often do we make these enormous assumptions about what other people are thinking and feeling and all that kind of stuff, where we've got this amazing algorithmic power for communication. We just want to skip over it and say, well, that's what right? So don't make assumptions. Don't make assumptions. And the fourth and final agreement is the first three are really hard. The first three are really hard. It is hard not to take things personally. It is hard not to make assumptions. It is hard to be impeccable with yourself and impeccable with others. It's really hard, and it's a discipline that you have to apply. And in truth, you're going to fail some days. Some days you're going to make an assumption, and some days you are going to take things personally, and some things you are not going to be impeccable. And I keep bringing it back to yourself, because I think that's the most important person that you need to be impeccable with is yourself. The fourth agreement is cut yourself some slack on that. You're doing your best. Note when you have failed, and go back to the top. And all of this is to say that language is powerful. Language is magic. It can create love. It can create hate. It can create anything in the world. And so, I'm just going to challenge you and ask you, if it's magic, you can use it for good, or you can use it for evil. That choice is up for you, but I think the world's a better place when we acknowledge the power of language, we acknowledge its ability to create, not just for the world, but for ourselves, and that we're careful with it.